Madam Rajvi, residents of Ashraf 3, people of Iran, the Iranian diaspora, and friends of the Free Iran movement around the world, I'd like to address the question, how strong is the regime in Tehran? Consider this. At home, the regime executes more of its own citizens per capita than any government in the world. Abroad, as you know, they send their militia and they arm Shia militias in neighboring countries to destabilize the neighborhood. Around the world, they conduct acts of terrorism, and they are enriching uranium at provocative levels, all of it to intimidate and to capture the attention of the world. And in order to have some bargaining power, they seize hostages, something they've been doing for many years. So when Mr. Hamid Nouri went on trial in Sweden, he was a prison official in 1988 during the massacre of up to 30,000 political prisoners, one of the largest crimes against humanity since World War II. Of course, the Iranian government seized a Swedish citizen, Mr. Ahmad Reza Jalali. But then, when they couldn't intimidate the Swedes, they found a better opportunity to try to trade him to Belgium for the freedom of Asadollah Assadi. Assadi, of course, is the Iranian spy who posed as a diplomat in Vienna and planned the mass casualty bombing of the Free Iran rally in 2018 north of Paris, at which many of us were present. He received a very heavy sentence a year ago in the Belgian court, so releasing him would be a terrible blow to the fight against international terrorism. Iran has taken journalists hostage in order to silence them and intimidate them from telling the truth. And if we go all the way back to the revolution in November of 1979, I believe the hostage crisis involving the United States Embassy had a fundamental impact on the clerical regime in Tehran. Not only did Ayatollah Khomeini paralyze the great American superpower, this made him much more powerful than the democratic forces that thought they were going to be able to conduct elections and have democracy after the corruption of the monarchy and the Shah of Iran. And this, of course, did not happen. But there's a greater effect from this hostage crisis. The American diplomats couldn't follow events in Iran. They missed what happened next in 1980 and 1981, as there was a rising struggle between democratic forces, many of them led by Masoud Rajavi and the PMOI, and Khomeini and the clerical dictatorship. This culminated, of course, when Rajavi called for Iranians to take to the streets, which they did on June 20, 1981, and the regime opened fire and began a reign of terror. What Washington has never understood, because they weren't paying attention, is that the PMOI was always a modern, gender-neutral, pro-democracy movement trying to end, if you will, the injustice of the Shah's reign. And they certainly opposed the dictatorship that was brought on by Khomeini. What makes Masoud Rajavi the enemy number one of this regime is that the PMOI are Muslim, and they challenged not only the political legitimacy, but the religious legitimacy of Ayatollah Khomeini and Ali Khamenei and the entire regime. And so if you look at the hostage taking over the years by this regime, much of it has to do with the PMOI. The fact that Washington missed this and doesn't understand it created a great vulnerability. It allowed the regime to promote an entirely false narrative about who the Mujahideen-e-Khalq really was, who Masoud Rajavi is, who Madam Rajavi is, who all of the people in Ashraf 3 really are. And this deception has gone on for over 40 years. I'll give you one example. The last time I read a New York Times article about Ashraf 3, they were interviewing former Mujahideen-e-Khalq people sitting in cafes in Tirana, nearby, and telling terrible stories about what is happening inside Ashraf 3. This was reported as though it is true. It reminded me of the Human Rights Watch report of many years ago, where former Mujahideen Ikhalq, people were interviewed by telephone and told terrible stories. These stories were all very suspicious and were debunked. Well, now we have found the Albanian authorities are now investigating former Mujahideen Ikhalq members in Albania who were the source of these stories. And so I'm here today to call on the major media outlets in the West, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere. It's time for you to realize you have been repeating false narratives. All of the things you have been saying about the Mujahideen Ikhalq, the NCRI, are distorted and false, and they serve a regime purpose. It's time to tell the truth. I'm sure that at today's rally there are many former dignitaries from governments around the world. Those dignitaries should all turn to the current incumbents of their governments and say, have the courage to speak to the NCRI. Well, here is a movement, a brave movement, mostly led by women in Ashraf 3, that has gone through so much. Even 10 years ago, they were still on the terrorism list for no good reason at all. And today, we have the opportunity to clear the air, tell the truth, and point out that the regime in Tehran can no longer rely on these tools of repression and falsehood and trading human beings as trade bait and threatening nuclear escalation and destabilizing sovereign neighboring countries. These are the actions of a very weak and vulnerable regime. Once we tell the truth about the regime in Tehran, once we expose how illegitimate they are and how false their religious credentials are, and how corrupt they are, and how little support they enjoy, we can look to the day when we will all be back in a free Iran. Thank you.